Hello beautiful people, this is Nick from Rain Room Productions, and today I'm going to show you how to create different types of pads using VITAL and just Ableton stock plugins. We're going to be making a basic pad and then progressing that into something a little bit more advanced throughout the video. I'll show you how to make a Dancey house pad, as well as an arpeggiating pad mostly using reverb, and using the same concept to create a pad with a guitar. So let's head on over into Ableton and we'll get started. Pads are almost always long sustained notes or chord progressions that can be synthesized with pretty much any sound using long attacks, sustain, decay, and release, or using large reverbs to create the same kind of effect. Okay, so let's take a look at this first one. Just a basic floaty, nice sounding pad. So we're gonna go ahead and recreate that. So we're gonna jump into VITAL over here. This is a fresh patch. Okay, so first thing we're gonna do is select a wavetable. I was using this one in the other patch, so we're just gonna continue with that one so we can try and get the similar result. I'm not really gonna use the envelope to shape the sound so much, but I am gonna use the release so that when you let the note off, it still has a bit of a tail on the end of it rather than it just cutting off abruptly. So this is going to sound like, so it kind of trails off at the end there. I tend to use the LFOs to shape the sound, so I'm going to map LFO 1 to the level of oscillator 1, and I'm going to create the shape that I want. We just want a slow attack, lots of sustain, and then a little bit of a release at the end there. And we're going to switch this to envelope so that it only plays through the envelope once. And we're going to change it to 2 bars to go through the whole envelope. Okay, I'm liking that part of the wavetable, and then I'm going to drop it down 12 semitones. And that's a basic idea of how to create the pad. Slow attack, sustain, and then slow release. The next basic fundamental idea for the pad is that usually pads are very wide, so I'm going to add 3 or 5 voices so that we have 2 on each side and then 1 coming straight down the middle essentially. And then we're going to bring the unison down to about like 8 to 10%. Kind of like it around 4% actually. So we're going to leave it there. And then we panned this one over to the right. So now we're going to get the second oscillator going. Basically, you want to make this sound as big and wide and lush as possible. And that's usually the idea behind a pad. So we're going to do the similar shape, slightly different from LFO 1, and we're going to make this one the squish flange. Okay, and same idea, we're going to do 3 voices. So what I did here was I made the frequency 4/1. I just want it to come in at a slightly different time than the first oscillator so that it gives it a little bit more width. When you have multiple different sounds coming in at different times, it just pulls your ear in different directions at different times. It just makes the sound a little bit more interesting. So for the last oscillator, all I did was selected basic shapes and I edited the waveform. So I got rid of all of this. Just double click to get rid of these. You're gonna go add source, wave source, and it already gives you the first module here, so we have that. We're gonna make that into a sine wave, or you can even have it as a wonky side wave, some other wave shape, and then you're gonna double click at the very end here, and we're gonna mess with this one a whole bunch too. It doesn't really matter what you do, it's basically we're just adding upper harmonics for the most part. Okay, so now we have this as our bass line for that oscillator, and then as you move the frame through, it changes to the other end of the oscillator that we created that shape for. So, and that one has a lot more upper harmonics. And we're gonna do the same thing, multiple voices. We'll go for 5 on this one, bring it down. You also want to make sure you bring your phase randomization all the way down to 0, because that way every time you play the keys the same sound is going to come out, rather than the synth playing the wave shape at a different point in the phase. So you might want a little bit of randomization, but in this case I want it to sound the same every time. And now we're just going to add the LFO 3 to our third oscillator. Same idea, similar shape, slightly different timing. Usually I like to add a little bit of noise. We'll just throw this on with LFO 3. Usually when I'm throwing noise in, I make it quite subtle, unless I'm using noise with like distortion, and then in that case it blends in really cleanly. But in this case I just wanted to add another layer of depth to the sound. It kind of just thickens it up. So now we'll move on to the filter. By default, only oscillator 1 is running through the filter. If you filter it down, it's only filtering down oscillator 1. So we're just going to select oscillator 2 and oscillator 3. I am not going to filter through the white noise. It pretty much gets rid of the white noise entirely if you filter it down. So I just brought the level down so you can just barely hear it, but it still adds a little bit of depth to the sound. So we'll throw another LFO on for the filter, using it as an envelope. I'm gonna go 2/1 and put that on envelope as well. I forgot to do that with all these. So another thing you can do to get a slightly different sound is use these oscillator modulating knobs. One of them that I kind of like was the formant scale. So this just gives it a different timbre, essentially, is what a formant shifting modulation does. And then you can see it's messing with the waveform. Okay, so let's try throwing another modulation algorithm on this second oscillator. Try the inharmonic stretch. Basically, the inharmonic stretch keeps the fundamental harmonic in place while shifting other harmonics up and down. So you can kind of hear like the fundamental is staying the same, but there's all this other stuff happening in between. So I'm gonna map that also to LFO 5, but just a tiny bit of movement there. Okay, so now if we throw it all together, there's a lot of different things happening there. And then finally we can move on to the effects. So a lot of times I'll throw the compressor on there, and it's always too much right off the bat if you listen. So we don't really want that. So normally I'll bring the top end down a bit and just bring the mix down. And then maybe throw an EQ on just to make sure that we're not getting over a certain frequency range ever. So I don't really want to get too much of this top end information. You can cut out the low end. And then lastly, we'll throw on a reverb, give it a little bit more size. And there you go. That's the basic idea for the first pad. So basically now I'll just go in and play around with the different modulations and we'll see what we get. It's got a nice little ringing happening in the background that I really like. Okay, so we'll move on to the next pad here. So here we go. This one's more of like a dancey, like house type pad that you would use in like a house track. And you can see that it's really basic here. So same idea with you want it to sound wide and thick and full. But this one has just a fast envelope. All we're gonna do on this one is we're using a square wave. So we're gonna go basic shape, turn it into a square wave. And Put it on envelope. Give it a couple of voices. I'm going to use a saw wave as well, just because they tend to have like a thicker sound, especially when they're pitched down. Gonna give it a few voices as well. Phase down to 0%. There we go. We have a nice lush pluck sound. And now we can go ahead and throw some effects on there. So throw delay on, play around with the spread and the mix here. Throw on the compressor. Kind of like it after the delay. Sometimes you just do things a little unorthodox and just mess around with the effects until you find something you like. There you go. Nice Dancey OC pad. On to the next. Valhalla's a shit. I know I said I was only using stock Ableton plugins, but this is a free reverb / delay plugin from Valhalla. I would highly recommend. This one's free. So what we have happening here, it's basically just an arpeggiated chord progression. And I've mapped a whole bunch of different things to these macros in an Ableton rack. So I have a dry wet knob mapped to the gain for the reverb and the dry signal so that we can completely wash it out and make it into like an ambient pad. I have this legato macro mapped to the decay and the sustain and attack of the whole entire Vital synth. So you can extend out from a pluck into like a nice floaty synth. I also have a little bit of Vital's reverb and delay mapped as well. Just the mix. It just gives it another texture to work with, and then the saw really thickens it up. Makes it feel more analog. So first thing I'm gonna do here, I'm just gonna copy up this chord progression. For the chord progression, it's really super easy, honestly. All I did was created a MIDI, scaled it down to C major. We'll go 1 bar. This is just a really quick and dirty way of just getting together a fast chord progression. So all you have to do is just create one chord, copy and paste it, and maybe add a couple notes here and there, and now you have a full chord progression going. I want to go into Ableton and grab an arpeggiator. So all we're doing here is we're creating a pluck. So we have the attack is really short, as well as the decay and the sustain. And just to make this a little bit more interesting, I'm going to do the same thing I did with that other pad. We're just going to go in here and mess with this waveform a little bit here. Give it some upper harmonics. A little bit of this, a little bit of that. See how it sounds. We're just going to shape this envelope for later, and I'm just going to map this to the LFO's frame just to give it a little bit of extra movement. And then that other one I used a Vital sign. phase down to 0. We have 3 voices of unison on this one, 5 on this one, panning this one to the left, oscillator 2 panned over to the right. I had a second oscillator. Just to give it a little bit more movement. And then we had this pitched up. We had the filter on, just mapped to LFO1 so it's moving around with everything else. I think I like that better for this one. And then we had oscillator 3. And we're also going to map this one both to both oscillators. So it adds a bit of movement. Phase down again. And then to get the opening up effect, we're going to map the decay to macro 1. As well as the attack, just barely moving the attack forward. Calling that legato. So that's the basic idea, and now we're ready to add some effects. So first thing, we'll throw on the compressor. Once you have that set the way you like it, I think I'm just gonna carve off a little bit more off the top. That sounds pretty good. Drive it a little. Now add some delay. We're gonna go ping pong. Set that any way you like, and then we'll throw on a reverb as well. And we're gonna map these to macro 2, map the mix, dry, wet, knob. Now we move on to the Ableton effects. So first thing we need to do is throw this all in a group. And we need to grab Valhalla Supermassive and Ableton's utility. Group these and create a wet and dry. So essentially what we're gonna do now is map everything to different macros like we did before. In order to map parameters from VITAL to Ableton, you just have to hit configure. It'll bring up the menu, and then you just click on the parameters that you would like to control. So I want to control the macros that I set within VITAL, as well as the oscillator volume for the saw wave. Once you've done that, just deselect configure, and macro 1 is legato. So I'm going to map that to macro 1, rename legato. Macro 2 is VITAL effects. Macro 3 is saw. Macro 4 is going to be our dry wet knob. What we're doing with this effect rack is creating a dry wet knob essentially. So I'm going to map this gain to macro 1. I'm going to map the volume of the dry signal to macro 1 as well. And then what you're gonna do is select map to adjust the parameters within that chain. So we're gonna use the dry signal, invert it. So now it's the opposite. So when we go up in volume in this, it's gonna be going towards the wet side. When we go down on the knob, it's gonna be going towards the dry side. And we don't want it to go to 35 dB. We probably only want it to go up to 0. Have a little bit of wet when it's dry and a little bit of dry when it's wet, and 0 dB for the dry mixer as well. Now, when it's all the way down, it's mostly dry. Now when you go all the way up, it's mostly wet. Okay, so the preset that I used is called Forever. Mix fully on. Delay 420 milliseconds-ish. Warp to 67.2%. About 60% feedback. High density. And you can basically just play around with the EQ on here. And fully wide. So now that's how you create that washed out effect, and basically turns that arpeggiated pattern into a pad. And I'm just gonna map this dry, wet, map that to macro 4. So now when it's to the left, fully dry. To the right, it's fully wet. Give everything a nice color. And that's how you do that one. The last one I had to show you was how to create a pad using audio. All I've done here, this one is essentially just with reverb. It's just a guitar strumming. With the volume shape automated here, so I just cut off the attack at the beginning, and with all the effects on, there's another nice floaty sound for you. So we'll just recreate this one. So first thing I usually do is cut out the low end at around 50 to 60 hertz. Put on a amp, Ableton's stock plugin, throw it on, clean, boost the mid and the treble a little bit, bring up the gain. And this works with any kind of audio. Like you can do pre-recorded synths. You can even use vocals as a pad. I'm using a guitar today. I'm gonna throw on a glue compressor just to bring out some of the smaller details. Threshold way down. And I kind of liked that it brought out a little bit of hiss, similar to the white noise that we used for the other pad. Then all we have to do is steal this effect rack that we made before, throw it on here. And if you want to get real crazy, you can throw auto pan on there. You can make it pan left and right, or what you can also do is turn the phase down, and then it's going to sound like it's swelling. And there you have it. That is 4 different types of pads that you can make for yourself. Just take the concepts that you learned with the envelope shape and you can apply that to any sound. You can see that's basically all we did with this guitar audio is I shaped the attack, and then the decay and the sustain are being shaped by the length of the reverb essentially. If you found this to be useful at all, please let me know. And if you have any questions, feel free to leave them down in the comments or shoot us an email. It's info@rainroomproductions.com. And we can answer any of your questions. Other than that, have a great day, and we'll see you for the next video. Peace. 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 Peace.